faculty list. Right. So if everything is all right, so we will go ahead, and I would like to invite our panelists, Dr. Mohan and Dr. Chavadi, both eminent personalities in their own subspecialties. I'd like to welcome my team from World Skull Base, Hadley Healthcare, and all the PGs who have joined us, some of whom are here right now, and some of whom will join us in our Facebook link. Generally, the crowd is more in our Facebook link. And this being a free version of Zoom, we are not allowed to take more candidates than what we already have right now. So a lot of people are watching us on Facebook Live as well. And I'm sure several more would join in to see the recordings, which will be put up in our social media handles and websites in the subsequent days. So today's case discussion is a rather interesting case of tympanojugular paraganglioma. This patient presented to me with a huge tumor about a year back. We did the first surgery in 2019, and the second surgery was done in 2020. So this being a very large tumor that went in both intradural and extradural, I had to plan the surgery in 2 stages. So it was a planned subtotal resection. The first stage involved infratemporal fossa and temporal resection. The second stage involved intradural resections. And the reason why we planned the surgeries and the way we went about it makes an interesting story. Equal partners and equal efforts have been put in by the eminent faculty in our team who are with us today during this lecture. So Dr. Mohan made huge contributions in managing the cardiovascular system and all the complications and all the challenges that came with managing a patient of this kind. Dr. Chavadi helped us with all the radiological investigations, and he and his colleague Dr. Kirti did the stenting of the carotid, which was a major step and very important what I would say intervention that helped us achieve total tumor resection towards the end. So the today's topic is an elaborate discussion of this one particular case. I believe that rather than have the so-called guest lectures where we give a glimpse of what we do, I think much more can be learned in discussing individual cases where we go in great detail and in-depth discussion is done regarding every single challenging case that we face. So I'm sure there's a lot to learn here from the eminent faculty here. And I'd like Kavita to begin the discussions by presenting the case and taking us through the history of the case. Following which, I think Dr. Mohan is going to be the next speaker, and he will talk to us about the challenges he faced in dealing with this particular patient, and with a brief on the management of a stent in the internal carotid artery. Mind you, again, stenting of the petrous internal carotid artery is not done routinely in most centers, and even in the top centers of this country. I do not know of too many patients who have undergone stenting of the petrous internal carotid artery, because that itself is a topic that can be discussed in detail, and some of which I'm going to probably touch upon in my slides. But yes, so the cardiovascular challenges and management of the cardiac system when there is a stent placed in the petrous carotid is something Dr. Mohan will speak about. And Dr. Chavadi, as usual, will talk to us about the radiological aspects of the tumor and both pre-op, intra-op, post-op, and I'm sure he'll be touching upon the interventional radiological aspects of placing a stent in the petrous carotid. I'm going to be the last speaker, and I will speak on the surgical management, and I'll take you through some of the pictures and videos of how we went about removing the tumor. So that will be the agenda for today. So I would request Kavita to step in and do the case presentation. Thank you. to introduce the speakers, right?
Yes, sir. I'll just share my screen.
Full screen. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so that's the speaker list. No, don't change. Go back to the old slide. Okay, so we have Dr. Chavadi, Dr. Mohan, and Dr. Kavita, our own consultant at Bangalore Skull Base Institute. Next slide, please. Since we do this, all of you are familiar with me and my team, so we go to the next slide, please. Dr. Chavadi, as all of you know, for most of you who are with us on a routine basis, he is a senior consultant radiologist and unit lead at Columbia Hospital, Sarjapur Road. He has been working with the Columbia Hospital since 5 years. Previously worked at KMC Mangalore and Sagar hospitals. No, go full screen, switch off your volume, I said. Mute yourself, please, and switch off your volume. Go to the next slide. There's an echo, no? Okay. So he was working at Columbia Hospital since 5 years. Previously worked at KMC Mangalore and Sagar hospitals. He has several publications and presentations at state, national, international conferences. Go back, please. Conferences in several workshops across the country. And as I told you before, he has been closely associated with World Skull Base, which is Section 8 public limited company dedicated to the teaching and training of skull-based surgery. And we are an international organization. And Chavadi has been constantly contributing to all the academic activities of our group. So Dr. Mohan Kumar is a senior consultant interventional cardiologist at Columbia Hospital, Sarjapur Road, and a consultant interventional cardiologist at Chinmaya Narayana Super Speciality Center, Bangalore. He's an associate consultant at Sakra World Hospital, and he did his training at the GB Pant Hospital, New Delhi. He is a fantastic physician, a charmer, truly, because I see that I think some of my patients like him more than they like me, because he's really a charming personality. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Mohan Kumar. This is your first time with us, and I am sure it will not be the last time you'll be with us. Thank you so much. So
thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan. The next speaker is Dr. Kavita. Kavita has been with me for a few years now, and she is a gold medalist at the AOB meeting in 2019. She has done her observership in endoscopic skull-base surgery at Narayana Multispeciality Hospital, and she has been a senior registrar at Manipal Hospital for 2.5 years, and she has several paper publications to her credit and a valuable asset to my group here at Adya Healthcare and World Skull Base. So, Kavita, you can go ahead with the rest of the slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Go back.
No, so can you hear me, sir?
Yeah. Okay. Go back to the previous slide.
That's loud. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Sampath sir, for this opportunity to present about the case of the month. We start with the etiopathogenesis will be dealing by me, and the cardiovascular implications renting will be will be dealt by Dr. Mohan sir, and the radiology aspects by Dr. Chavadi sir, and surgical approaches by Dr. Sampath Chandra Prasad Rao sir. Here we start this evening with the case details of a patient who is 28-year male patient, Shrikant Nagarajan from Bangalore, presented with the sounds in the right ear since 3 years. So after that, he consulted a physician. Then he was treated with the medical line for the tinnitus. So after that, in July 2016, somewhere otoscopy was done, and they found out a mass behind the tympanic membrane, and the MRI was done, which was suggesting the feature of tympanojugular paraganglioma. And they referred to the ENT surgeon who did a laser excision and the tumor removal, which was outside elsewhere. And after 2 years, he developed all lower cranial palsy with the facial nerve palsy, deviation of face, inability to close eyes, and completely lost his voice. And then when the repeat MRI was done to find out any increase in the size of the tumor or anything, the repeat MRI was done. And they referred this case to Bangalore Skull Base Institute to Dr. Sampath Chandra Prasad Rao, sir. Then they started evaluating this case. We started with the MRI. So MRI was showing a jugular foramen mass, that is intensive, hyper intense, highly intense, and which is showing the salt and pepper appearance. Showing the vascular nature of the tumor. And you can see the internal carotid artery. It is encasing the internal carotid artery, and it is extending to the CP angle cistern and pressing onto the cerebellum and extending to the petrous apex region. And we also did a whole body CT. So PET scan is important in some cases. So where just to rule out other tumors and to see the extension of the tumors. So we can see a huge tympanojugular paraganglioma here. So enhancement you can see in that region. So after the PET CT, we decided tympanojugular paraganglioma type C4, for which so C type means it is involving the carotid, petrous part of the carotid, for which the decision of stenting was done. So stenting major indication is in tympanojugular is a C type tumors. So in other indications are ICA engulfment more than 70%, ICA stenosis, and single ICA, and insufficient collaterals. And in our case, we put 1 to 3 stents in our case. In these patients, they should be on lifelong antiplatelet therapy. And these stents are put 4 to 6 weeks before the surgery, so that the neointima is formed. And also the advantage of these stents are we can nicely, safely dissect around the internal carotid artery, which in this case the petrous part was involved. And also we can do a safe mobilization of the internal carotid artery. Here we can see the stent which was placed in the petrous part of the internal carotid artery. These are the dimension. This is self-expandable stents were used. Digital subtraction angiography is one of the most gold standard investigation in finding the tympanojugular paraganglioma. It's a non-invasive, it's a gold standard for diagnosing the angiography of the architecture of the tumor, as well as the architecture of the vessels supplying the tumor, so that embolization, pre-embolization can be decided for the feeding vessels. So this was done just 24 hours before surgery, in which we embolize. So after digital subtraction and angiography, we found out 5 feeding vessels, one of which was the ascending pharyngeal artery. And so these are the other feeders, that is a posterior branch of right internal maxillary artery. And this is the right occipital artery. After the endovascular coiling, there is no tumor blush. So before that, there was a tumor blush. even here. So ascending pharyngeal artery before embolization, can see the tumor blush. So polyvinyl alcohol and endovascular coils were used in our case, and other two are posterior branch of middle meningeal artery, and one more is the small twig from the carotico-tympanic branch of petrous ICA. So after embolization with the PVA materials and endovascular coils, there was no tumor blush. So patient underwent right-sided intratemporal fossa type A approach and removal of extradural tumor on 6/3/2019. So immediate post-op scan was done. So we follow a protocol of doing immediately within 24 hours, repeat the post-op scan just to rule out any intracranial hemorrhages, operative site hemorrhage, and post-operative changes. I'll just show you. Okay. So this is a post-operative cavity, a single cavity of a mastoid, middle ear, and cochlea and vestibule. So extradural part of the tumor is removed. So as sir said, we decided to remove in a two-stage. First extradural, as next stage will be the intradural tumor in view of avoiding the complication of CSF. So this some of the air bubbles are seen here. This is the fat tissue which we use for obliteration. So after 6 months, the patient was followed with the MRI scan. So this shows a vascularized lesion, intradural part. There is a clear demarcation between the fat we use for the obliteration in the first surgery and the intradural part. You can see it is pressing onto the cerebellum, extending to the cerebropontine system. On follow-up with us, on examination, there was a post-oral wound and blind sac region was healthy, and nose, throat, NAD, and head and neck normal. So mainly the facial nerve, which was initially more great, we did also anterior transposition of the facial nerve intraop. So after 6 months, the facial function was once again resumed to grade 3. So patient is able to close the eyes tightly. And on pure tone audiometry, there was a profound hearing loss on the right side, for which we planned the bone anchored hearing aid. On lower cranial examination, so vocal cords are mobile on either side. On the right side, there was a little restriction. Otherwise, the mucosal waves are well seen. So it looks like compensated. And we did a fiber optic endoscopic evaluation of swallowing. So patient tolerated all 3 feeds, all the solid, liquid, semi-solid consistency, and you can see a little pooling in the right piriform fossa. So then after all this evaluation, we planned for the removal of the intradural part. Then once again, we repeated the MRI. Which as previously I described, this is the fat and this is the intradural part. There was a little 30% increase in the size of the tumor compared to the 6 months follow-up. This is a pre-op CT. Which is showing the intradural part of the tumor, where the petrous posterior portion is dehiscent here because of this thing, and anteriorly you can see the carotid ICA stent, petrous part of the ICA stent, and also it is involving the petrous part of the temporal bone. And this is the fat. This is one single cavity. with the this is a one single cavity post-op, and some these structures are the endovascular coils which were used for stenting. And once again, we planned for embolization. DSA showed feeders were ascending pharyngeal artery and the middle meningeal artery. So this is a tumor blush which is seen pre-embolization. And after embolization with the polyvinyl alcohol particles, there was no tumor blush. So so patient underwent right-sided petro-occipital transsigmoid approach and removal of intracranial and intradural component of the tympanojugular paraganglioma with bone-anchored hearing aid implantation on 8th of August 2020. So following which after about 10 days, so after about 10-15 days, patient developed the meningitis for with lumbar puncture and CSF analysis suggestive of pyogenic meningitis, for which we started intravenous antibiotics and followed by oral antibiotics. Most probably this is because of the chemical meningitis or a post-oral wound which was not healing. And so post-op, we repeated, the patient was there in ICU for 1 day with stable listening. You can see one single cavity with no tumor left, and this is all fat what we can see. It is a single cavity, no hemorrhage, intracranial hemorrhage. This is a follow-up post-op facial nerve pictures. So we can see the eye closure. So complete eye closure. This is a light eye closure with the light. This is a closure with tight eye closure. So patient is able to close eyes. Once again, it is a grade 3 facial nerve palsy. And 11th nerve, accessory nerve. So patient is able to shrug his shoulders. So it's normal. And hypoglossal, you can see, so it is also compensated. So little bit about skull base. Okay. Thank you so much. Now the next speaker will be Dr. Mohan sir, who will be discussing about cardiovascular implications. And okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so now just to summarize what has been told by Dr. Kavita, this patient had a massive tumor. He was operated once before by an ENT surgeon with the tumor removed. Dealt with, I would say, like a tympanomastrocytopenia or a glomus tympanium rather than a true glomus tubulare. So there was a transcanal laser ablation done, for which it was realized that it was a tympanojugular paraganglioma. This patient was referred to me after about a year. By then, the patient had developed full facial nerve paralysis, multiple low cranial nerve paralysis in terms of cranial nerve 9th, 10th, and the 11th cranial nerves. So, intraoperatively, in the first surgery, as I told you, we planned to remove the extradural part. And in that, we realized that the facial nerve was infiltrated by the tumor, and that's why he had a 1 year pre-op facial nerve paralysis. I could salvage the nerve, but it was completely, I mean, the neurophysiology of the nerve was quite poor, and I decided to, instead of leaving the nerve behind, I decided to sacrifice the nerve and do a sural nerve grafting. So a sural nerve grafting was done after during the first stage, and the extradural infratemporal part of the tumor was removed. The lower cranial nerves were already paralyzed preoperatively. Intraoperatively, there was no point saving them, and we focused on tumor removal, which was aided by a stented carotid. Now, post-operatively, the patient developed a grade 3 facial nerve paralysis, recovered. I mean, not developed, I would say patient recovered from a grade 6 to a grade 3 facial nerve paralysis. And the lower cranial nerves compensated. So the opposite cranial nerves, that is the 10th, the vagus on the one side, and the hypoglossal, and the 9th cranial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerves, compensated for the functions of the loss of cranial nerves on the ipsilateral side. So with this, we went in for a second stage removal. Once the lower cranial nerves have been compensated adequately on the opposite side, we can go in and do a total tumor resection and not fear about any nerve loss on the ipsilateral side, because they've already been compensated. So as I told you, I'm going to come in for the surgical part and the surgical steps. So with both these surgeries, we could completely remove the tumor. Now, the reason for staging this is not only because the tumor was large, but it's primarily because in a large tumor that is both intradural, extradural, infratemporal, and intradural, if we resect everything in one go, which is done in a few centers, but I would say it's a rather old-fashioned way of looking at things. There will be a CSF leak that goes down into the upper neck. Now, this is a fairly large space, which would mean that the patient would require a lumbar drainage for a long period of time, and that can lead to other complications. So we prefer to stage the surgery always. In every tumor that is both intra and extradural, I prefer to stage unless it's a very small intradural component. Like if it's a less than 1 centimeter tumor, I would not want to go ahead and remove it. I would not mind removing, but if it's a fairly big tumor, I would remove it. So that is the reason behind staging of these tumors. The second reason being that if during the extradural resection, if the lower cranial nerves and all these tumors are in the jugular bulb, in the area of the lower cranial nerves, so if there is any damage to the lower cranial nerves, in this patient there was already a pre-op lower cranial paralysis. Now, if this happens intraoperatively, either in a normal lower cranial nerve, or if there is a worsening of a pre-existing lower cranial nerve paralysis, this it will give removing half the tumor and letting some time pass, that is about 6 months to a year, would lead to compensation of the opposite cranial nerves. And at that time, going intradural makes more sense. Okay, because when we go intradural, again we encounter lower cranial nerves, and we don't have to worry really about preserving the lower cranial nerves intradurally in the cerebellopontine angle. So these are the two reasons why we opt for a staged resection when there is a massive extradural and a massive intradural element. So Dr. Mohan, the stage is yours for you to enlighten us about what were the challenges that you faced in dealing with the case.
Okay, sir. First of all, thank you for inviting me for this.
We can't hear you. I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I did unmute it.
Can you hear me now? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I can hear you, Dr. Mohan. I can hear you.
Yeah, I think. Can you hear me now?
No,
I can hear you.
Can't hear you.
I'm able to hear Dr. Mohan.
No, you can hear. Huh?
I can.
Okay, we can hear. Sorry, my computer was muted. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry about it. Yes, please go ahead.
Dr. Mohan, you have to unmute yourself now.
Somebody is muting me, actually. I had unmuted.
Okay. Now we can hear you. Yes, thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So, and first of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to treat this patient, which is actually a rare substrate of patient. We don't see paraganglionomas with presenting to our clinic. So, first of all, I will thank you, Dr. Sampath, for giving me the opportunity to treat the patient together. So the challenges which we had in this patient is, see, first of all, whenever there is a gangliomas, paraganglionomas, or if it is a pheochromocytomas, whether is it an hormonally functioning tumor or not, that's what we need to differentiate. So this patient, when he came to me for the first time, that time his heart rate was very high, heart rate was around 148 per minute, and BP was very high, 170 by 130. So he was a newly diagnosed hypertensive at that point of time. So before we send the patient for any surgeries, we must optimize this blood pressure. See what happens, since this is an hormonally functioning, clinically also it looked like it is an hormonally functioning tumor. First thing, we need to confirm whether it is an hormonally functioning tumor or not. And as we know, most of these paragangliomas are benign tumors. They will secrete the hormones, but they won't spread it to the other places. So first thing what we should evaluate is it an hormonally functioning tumor or not? For that, we had sent this vinyl normetanephrines, 24 hours urinary normetanephrines. That had come very high, actually. It was around 5,000. That is almost like 20 times more than that of normal range. So that means it was a functionally secreting tumor. So before sending the patient to the surgery, we must optimize this. We must suppress these hormones. So we must optimize the heart rate and blood pressure. For that, we had to use antihypertensive medications. Preferably, we use alpha blockers and the beta blockers. In this situation, first we must suppress the alpha receptor. So patient was given alpha blocker. After 1 week, I had started him on labetalol. So initially he was put on prazopressine. Then after 1 week, the patient was also given beta blocker. 10th day, after I think 10 days after initiation of this medication, his blood pressure became normal. That is the time the patient was taken up for the surgery. So that is the one component. So basically, we must appropriately manage the blood pressure. So what will happen during the tumor resection? There will be an increase in the release of this noradrenaline. So intraoperatively, the BP will go very high. And post-operatively, what will happen, since we have resected the tumor, then the BP will fall. So we must prevent the intraoperative hypertension and post-operative hypotension. So what we did in these cases? So before we took him off for the surgery, so patient was appropriately alpha blockaded with prazopressine and labetalol. Labetalol is a non-selective beta blocker. So we had used appropriately, and the BP before the surgery was below 140/90, and heart rate was less than 100. So, and intraoperatively, another thing, important thing what we should remember is the volume status should be well maintained. So this patient was given appropriate volumes before sending the patient for the surgery. So after the surgery, anyway, we had to down titrate these medications. So extradural resection, when they had done, after that, the patient was something like some 600 mg of labetalol. I had to come down to something like 300 mg. Of course, we did continued prazopressine 5 mg. From 5 mg, I had reduced it to 2.5 mg. So this was the one thing. The first surgery went very smoothly. I think Dr. Sampath had done a great job. Actually, I don't see so many people doing this sort of surgeries. So after the first surgery, everything went smoothly. As it was, Dr. Kavita had mentioned, the facial nerve palsy and all was improved after the surgery. So patient also was very happy. The second important component was the antiplatelet management. So they had placed an petrous intracoronary carotid artery stenting was done. So whenever we place a stent, what happens? We must continue this dual antiplatelet agent at least for 1 month. After 1 month, what happens? There will be an endothelization. So we can actually stop the medication for a brief period and reintroduce this single antiplatelet after 1 month. So that's why the surgery was planned after 1 month of doing this intracarotid artery stenting. So what we did was we stopped this antiplatelet. See, this was an intracranial surgeries. We don't mind continuing this aspirin in other surgeries. If any bleeding intracranially, it becomes a big catastrophe. So that's why we had to stop the dual antiplatelets for at least, I think, 7 days. We had stopped this medication, and he was shifted on LMWH for a brief period till we reintroduce this aspirin. So this was the management. So after post-operatively, after removal of this extradural tumor, is a requirement of antihypertensive had come down, but still he had required medications. So before this intradural surgery, so again the same steps were followed. So we had to optimize the medications. The BP was well controlled intraoperatively and post-operatively. There was not much of an hypertension or hypotension because we had adequately alpha blockade and beta blockage was done, and also appropriately intravascular volume was maintained. So we didn't face any hypertension in the second part of the surgery also. So, but the only thing is he started developing this headache and vomiting sensation. So clinically it looked like a meningitis. So that's how we had to do the CSF analysis, and we started him on the antibiotics. With that, he slowly improved, and even the facial paralysis, everything recovered. After the second surgery, actually what happened, I stopped this alpha blockage, and he was on a small dose of beta blockage, that labetalol. That also before discharge, I had to stop it because the BP came down to normal. So now the patient is off antihypertensives. That means whatever the surgery which Dr. Sampath had done, I think it proved great help for the patient. So patient is completely off antihypertensive at this point of time. So actually my role was not that much compared to what Dr. Sampath has done for this patient. I think it was a very long surgery, like say 18 hours. I can't even imagine that somebody is doing some 18-hour surgery.
No, sir. The surgery went on so smoothly only because of the foundation that you laid. I think it was brilliant cardiovascular management, and we had absolutely no problems. As you said, intraoperative fluctuations in blood pressure was something that we were scared of. But quite honestly, even in the first stage, when there was a significant part of the tumor removed, but still a significant part of tumor left behind, we still did not have too much of an intraoperative fluctuation, or probably the tumor that was left behind was in fact stabilizing the pressure, or I don't know what exactly, but it was quite a smooth affair. And also the whole phenomenon of managing the stent, where we had to, as you explained, where you had to wean on and wean off the patient with that anticoagulant measures. All that was done so smoothly, and as I told you, the patient is very, very charmed by you, and he holds you in very high esteem, and every time he comes to me, he's very happy after meeting you. I don't see those broad smiles after he leaves me, but after meeting you, he comes back with a broad smile, and he's always a happy man. So thank you, sir. Thank you so much for being a part of this case, and I'm sure we'll team up for much more such cases in the future, and hopefully be of help to some of our patients. So
thank you. So it was a great actually teamwork basically. So including our ICU team and even Dr. Sunil for that matter, the physician. Yes. So and everybody, we had discussions for even a smallest problem. We did discuss together, and actually speaking, everything went very smoothly, except that meningitis probably that was also part of this procedure per se, because of whatever the reason the meningitis has happened.
Correct. So regarding the meningitis, since you are involved in the treatment, I would probably come to that point. I was thinking of discussing this towards the end as a part of the sequelae, complications, other things. So let me just touch that upon right now, now that we are discussing this point. So what happened was the patient was discharged. So we had removed all the sutures. There was one small suture, a single small, I would say 0.5 mm wound dehiscence right at the end of the incision after the second surgery. So we had removed all the sutures, and after the suture removal, there was one small dehiscence. Otherwise, the rest of the wound had closed. So this patient had gone home, and it was close to the 10th day, post-op day, that he came back to us with headache. And any headache after intracranial surgery obviously has to be taken seriously. So that's when I called you and Dr. Sunil, and we all, and of course the neurologist, and we jumped in to treat it quite aggressively, I would say. And yes, we did a CSF tap which showed signs of meningitis. But to everybody's credit, I would say there was no much fuss. Patient was on IV antibiotics, and I think the patient was admitted for close to 10 days. And then on oral antibiotics for a month or so, and he recovered completely without any sequelae except for the headache. The headache also came down quite quickly over the next 3-4 days, and then it was just a stay in the hospital till the temperature reached normal. And we had these small fluctuations in temperature, 9900 for a good I would say 5, 6, 7 days, which we had to make sure that it had reached absolutely normal before we send the patient home. So that was the only hiccup, I would say. But then yeah, you can't expect
Yeah.
everything to go according to plan, so you can't have the cake and eat it though. So that's all.
Yeah. Yeah, correct, sir. Actually, no, it was a very great case. In fact, we picked, I mean, whatever best what we could have able to do from medical point of view, we have done that actually. So as I am trying to tell, this surgical component per se is a very big thing. Whatever the medical component which we have supported you, it's a very small thing in front of whatever you have done. That's what I felt. It's a great case, sir, whatever it's. And the good thing is that now the patient is absolutely normal. He's
Correct.
recovered, the facial nerve has recovered, he's off antihypertensives. And actually last time when I met him, actually was very happy that he was all like, everything was like normal. He was like normal person now. So 28 years, almost like you have given one new life to him.
Exactly. Considering the age of the patient, I'm so happy that things went on well. And to add to this, some of these things I wanted to, discuss towards the end, but now we are having this discussion right now. So there was an emotional component because he had gotten married recently also. And while he was being operated by me for the first time, there was an ENT surgeon operated before, but when I took him for the infratemporal fossa approach, his wife was in fact pregnant. And she was very, very apprehensive. And if you remember, she was breaking down quite a lot of times throughout the whole affair, the first surgery. And in the second surgery, the baby had delivered, so they had a newly born baby. So that again, adds on to a little bit of an emotional pressure for all of us to make sure that things go well. Apart from the fact that the patient and the patient's family themselves go through a lot of stress, we also were a little, I would say, due to the young age and the fact that it was a new family, a newly wedded couple, and a new baby that had come into the world. It was a little bit of an added pressure on all of us. But all's well that ends well, as they say.
Yes, sir. Sure.
Thank you so much, sir. And
please.
Yeah, thank you. So, Dr. Chavadi, so we're all waiting to listen to your lecture, and I'm sure you have a few slides. And radiology, as usual, you make it look so lucid. Your presentations are always top class. So we look forward to your presentation. Chavadi, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Sampath, for that kind introduction. As usual, this is another journey of some complex skull-based cases that I have been doing with Dr. Sampath since the last 2 to 3 years. And today I shall share about this case. Okay. I hope everybody is able to see my slides.
Yes, we can see your slides. You can go full screen if you wish to.
Yeah.
Perfect. All
okay.
Good.
So yeah, so it's about the paraganglia imaging, paragangliomas imaging. There's no anything specific for this. The imaging protocol remains the same. Whatever skull-based tumor pathology, because it can throw a lot of surprises once we start looking at the case. To name a few, there are glomus jugulae, carotid body tumor, glomus vagal, glomus tympanicum. So before I go into this case, I would want to refresh and reiterate anatomy, which is the most important component of our imaging. So I will not be discussing about the entire temporal bone or the skull base. Rather, I will focus to the jugular bulb, which is the area of discussion today. So I have come down somewhere in the middle of the temporal bone in the region of cochlea promontory. So I am somewhere in the mesotympanum. So as I also already discussed in the prior sessions, CT imaging we do in the with the thinnest possible reconstruction, that is 0.6 mm with the overlap reconstruction, so that we can do multiplanar reconstruction in any desired plane, either sagittal, coronal or axial. Also we do MRI with contrast. So this coming to the CT, once we do a CT, we take right and left temporal bone separately with a small field of view, that is 7 centimeter. So here I'm seeing okay, I will take the laser pointer. Hope my laser pointer is visible. And this is the cochlear promontory.
Yes, it's visible, yes.
And this is the cochlear aqueduct. Why do I say this is a cochlear aqueduct? This is because I have come to the level just below the internal auditory canal. So the cochlear aqueduct runs parallel in the similar direction like an internal auditory canal, but it is much smaller in size compared to the internal auditory canal. As I come down, now we are seeing sort of three rounded canal areas. This is the carotid canal, and this is the jugular bulb. In between the carotid canal and jugular bulb, you are seeing a lucency. This is the tympanic canaliculus, which carries the Jacobson nerve, branch of ninth cranial nerve. Why is it important to look for this tympanic canaliculus? This is because supposing this tympanic canaliculus is enlarged, then it means to say it's an aberrant course of internal carotid artery, which is a normal variant, which has to be picked up and mentioned by a radiologist, because if this is not evaluated preoperatively, it can be a surgical disaster once they go for a surgery or drill this part of the bone. As we go to the next section, we can see carotid canal, pars nervosa and pars vasculosa. Pars vasculosa is a jugular bulb. So between the pars vasculosa and pars nervosa, there is a spicule of bone which is jugular spine. Every tiny bit of bone is very important roadmap for a surgeon. So this tiny bit of bone has to be accounted and mentioned. As we go down, the tympanic canaliculus goes and ends in the pars nervosa. You continue to see the carotid canal, jugular bulb. What separates the carotid canal and the jugular bulb is the carotico-jugular spine, also known as crotch, because of its shape. Now the jugular bulb rests posteriorly on the jugular process of the basi-occiput bone. This is the jugular process of basi-occiput. As we go down, we can see the stylomastoid foramen through which the facial nerve exits. This was on the axial. That's what routinely the radiologist look at. As I said, because we acquire isometric volume imaging, we can do coronal and sagittal reconstruction. This is the same patient's coronal CT. The right side is operated, so you lost lot of anatomy, whereas the left side, which is unoperated, I can use it to demonstrate the anatomy. So close to the jugular bulb, you have a jugular tubercle, which forms the beak on the superior margin of the hypoglossal canal. Below the jugular tubercle is the hypoglossal canal. Below the hypoglossal canal is the occipital bone, and this is the lateral mass of C1. This is how we appreciate it on a coronal. And coronal, the jugular bulb is forming the floor of the hypotympanum. Also, you can appreciate the cochlear aqueduct here. So when it comes to imaging of the jugular, glomus jugulare, CT is important to look for the bony margins of the tumor. This is because there are multiple differentials in this region, which the bony for which we have to evaluate the bony margin. In glomus jugulare, there will be typical moth-eaten pattern of bony destruction. In the CT, we also assess for the ossicles, the labyrinth, also the erosion of the keratojugular spine. As I have shown you in the previous image, how the keratojugular spine looks like. Erosion of this is known as Phelps sign, which is more specific for a glomus jugulare tumor. Look for extension to the middle ear, extension to the infratemporal fossa, most of which were there in this case. When it comes to MRI, there are certain specific signs that are specific to this paragangliomas, which are a hypervascular tumor, that being a salt and pepper appearance. Salt is bright. Bright is because the methemoglobin or slow flow appears bright on MRI. The pepper, that is black, the flow voids appear black on T2 weighted MRI. So because it's a hypervascular tumor, whenever the lesion is more than 2 centimeters, it gives this salt and pepper appearance. If the tumor is very small, it may not give this typical salt and pepper appearance. And invariably, we do a contrast enhanced study. Why is it important? It helps us to differentiate from the other lesions that happen in this region. Like a paraganglioma, which is hypervascular, will show early intense enhancement and rapid washout after 2 to 3 minutes. Whereas if it is a schwannoma, it shows early non-enhancement. On delayed, there will be hyper enhancement. So looking at the enhancement pattern, we can try to narrow our differentials. In MRI protocol, routinely we include routine pre-contrast sequences followed by the contrast enhanced MRI. Also MR angiography. This is because the lesion, because of its close proximity to the carotid vessels, it's important to look for the intracranial vessels, including carotid artery, which was important in this case, and also MR venography. We look for all the sinuses, including sigmoid sinus and jugular vein. As Dr. Kavita already showed you and described you the importance of angiography, a distal subtraction angiography is used to look for the tumor blush, feeding vessel, especially most common feeding vessels is the ascending pharyngeal artery from external carotid artery, but it can acquire feeding vessels from multiple, including intracranial, that is carotid artery, and the early draining vein. The early draining vein is diagnostic for a highly vascular paraganglioma. Angiography is not just important for the diagnosis, but also for the management of this jugulotympanic paraganglioma. It also helps us to demonstrate the degree of internal carotid artery involvement, the flow in the contralateral cerebral blood flow, the venous drainage. It aids in preoperative embolization, as was done in this case of surgery. The preoperative embolization is usually done 1 to 2 days prior surgery, because if it is done much earlier, there can be recruitment and revascularization of the tumor. So what are the differentials for this lesion in this region? As I said, one is schwannoma. In the paragangliomas, the bony destruction is more of moth-eaten appearance, whereas in case of schwannoma, it's a sharply demarcated bony margins. And there will be no flow voids because schwannomas are not very vascular, no salt and pepper, and Indian 11 octreotide will be negative, radionuclide scan will be negative. Other lesions that can mimic a paraganglioma in this region are bony mets. Bony mets, especially the hypervascular mets from the metastasis from renal cell carcinoma or thyroid. Meningioma is very rare in region, but it can throw a surprise. What we see in meningioma is more of hyperostosis or some calcification. Also beware, we get a very commonly anatomic variations, among them being a very prominent asymmetric high riding jugular bulb, as you are seeing here. It looks like a lytic lesion in the region of jugular bulb, but if you follow the vein, you can see that it is continuous with the vein without any invasion. And other tumor is the endolymphatic sac tumor. But the endolymphatic sac tumor will be centered on the vestibular aqueduct instead of being centered on the jugular bulb. Vestibular aqueduct is a hockey-shaped structure which comes right behind the vestibule and the lateral semicircular canal. Just to show you how the differentials look like, this is a moth-eaten appearance of a paraganglioma. You can see that there is a wide zone of transition. That is, you cannot say where the lesion ends and where the normal bone starts. It is sort of wide zone of transition with irregular appearance. Whereas if it is a schwannoma here, it will be uniformly enhancing with a well demarcated, sharply demarcated margins. You can definitely tell where the tumor ends and where the normal bone starts. Other differentials are cholesteatoma, although rare. It's very easy to diagnose cholesteatoma on an MRI. If you do a non-echoplanar haze diffusion sequence, they appear very bright on a diffusion weighted sequence. I'm just showing you an example of external aortic canal cholesteatoma, which is very bright on a haze diffusion. This is known as a light bulb sign because it lights up in the sequence. And other differentials are epidermoid. Epidermoid are very specific that they don't enhance and they show diffusion restriction, and on FLAIR they show partial suppression. Meningiomas and METs are already mentioned. I'm just showing you a companion case. This is not our case which was operated, but a companion case. This is a case which I had come across before while reporting our teleradiology. We are seeing a large lesion which is centered around the jugular bulb. We are seeing there's extradural, intradural extension into the CP angle with mass effect on the cerebellum, partly on the brainstem. There's extension to the petrous apex. If you can see these bright areas, this is the cochlea and posterior to the vestibule. So the lesion is also extending to the labyrinth. And on sagittal MR contrast enhanced imaging, you are seeing it is brightly enhancing. And you can see multiple tortuous black areas. These are the flow voids, that is the hypertrophied arteries probably arising from the external carotid artery, branches of ascending pharyngeal artery supplying the tumor. And this is the diffusion sequence. There is no diffusion restriction. If it were to be an epidermoid or a cholesteatoma, it would have shown diffusion restriction. and a moth-eaten irregular destruction appearance on a CT scan, bright enhancement on an axial contrast MRI. So this fits into all the features of paraganglioma with extensions as described. Also, whenever we come across this paraganglioma, it is important to differentiate a mastoid tympanic paraganglioma from a tympanojugular paraganglioma. Basically, if you look at, so invariably we do both MRI and CT, we just don't stop at MRI. So if you see the jugular foramen, which is very well seen on a CT, if it is free of the tumor or if it is free of all anatomic distortion, it is most likely to be a tympanomastoid paraganglioma. Coming to our case, the pre-op MRI was done outside. I've just taken a representative images to show you the appearance of this tumor. This is the axial T2 weighted because CSF is bright. You can see the lesion centered around the jugular bulb. You can see multiple tiny dots, that is black, that is pepper, and also bright areas. So this is a salt and pepper appearance because of the hypervascular tumor. So any hypervascular tumor which is more than 2 centimeters can show this appearance. But in this region, paragangliomas are more specifically seen. On a contrast enhanced axial MRI, we can see the lesion is partly encasing the internal carotid artery. Here, this is the going to be a petrous segment of internal carotid artery, which is partly encased. As you go one slice higher up, you can see the lesion is extending to the petrous apex, petrous temporal bone, also encasing the internal carotid artery. Posteriorly, the sigmoid sinus seems to be free. There is intradural extension to the CP angle and intracranial with some amount of mass effect on the right cerebellar hemisphere. Again, I am showing you the representative images of the CT we done in March 2019. This was after the first surgery. You can see multiple artifacts which was because of pre-op embolization of the tumor, as Dr. Kavita had already showed you. And this is the fat packing within the resected tumor. And this part, which is the enhancing tumor, is the residual tumor after the first surgery. And you can also appreciate the stent in the petrous segment of the internal carotid artery. So after 5 months after surgery, a follow-up MRI was done. If you compare the residual tumor from the prior imaging done in the March, you can see there is at least some 25 to 30% increase in size of the tumor with intradural extension, that is intracranial extension, and mild mass effect on the right cerebellar hemisphere. This is on the axial. On coronal, you can also see intracranial and some amount of infratemporal extension of the tumor. And the tumor, you can see that tumor is encasing the stent of the petrous segment internal carotid artery. And this was following the second surgery. There is near total significant debulking of the intracranial component of the tumor with very small residual tumor in the region of petrous apex, probably which will be taken care by radiotherapy. And also there is fat packing in this region of the surgery. This is the fat appears black on CT. So significant reduction in the size of tumor. Also, after the surgery, which was done on 9/8/2020, 3 weeks later, patient presented with severe headache. So we did a MRI, routine plain and contrast MRI. I am directly showing you the post-contrast flare images, the representative images. This is post-contrast flare is very sensitive to pick up any leptomeningeal irritation or leptomeningeal enhancement. On the right side, compared to the left, you can see in the parietal cell side, there are some bright foci. This is the leptomeningeal enhancement. Again, you can see compared to the left, there is some bright enhancement in the leptomeninges on the right side. Also some bright spots in the white matter. So this compared to the T1 post-contrast, flare post-contrast is more sensitive to pick up leptomeningeal irritation. So this suggests that there is some leptomeningeal irritation going on. This can be because of any blood which can happen post-operatively or also because of any mild meningitis. And this has to be correlated with the CSF fluid analysis. Also, because this was a post-contrast MRI, we could appreciate the residual small tumor which is left in the petrous apex. And also the right sigmoid and jugular sinus were obliterated as a part of surgery. Following antibiotics, the patient recovered completely. So when it comes to reporting, as I said, imaging is same for any skull-based tumor, irrespective of what it is. A thin section CT, a contrast MRI with thin sections and 3D sequence, MR angiography, MR venography. And when it comes to reporting, in particular to the paragangliomas, along with the local extension and all the anatomic landmarks, as I mentioned, we have to see whether they're involved, eroded, extended. In addition, for this paragangliomas, we have to look for intradural extension, whether there's extension to the foramen magnum, clivus, cavernous sinus, because involvement of these areas are considered to be more complex. Involvement of ICA, as was seen in our case. Also, we should look whether there is a single ICA or both ICA are equally dominant. Vertebral artery involvement, we have to look for dominant or unilateral sigmoid sinus on the lesion side. Sometimes the sigmoidal sinus on the opposite side might be non-dominant, might be very hypoplastic, in which case this may be the dominant drainage. This is because obliteration of sigmoid sinus and closure of jugular vein may be a part of surgery. Also, as we all know, paragangliomas can be multiple. We have to do a whole body PET CT to look for multiple paragangliomas. So this is about radiology in imaging in temporal bones. Now I would like to request Dr. Sampath.
Thank you, Dr. Chavadi. That was brilliant presentation, very informative. I always learn something new from each of your presentations, even if we've done this several times together. So regarding this particular case, a couple of things that I wanted to ask you. Now, we know that paragangliomas are slow-growing tumors. Now, in this particular case, if you go back through your slides itself, you had mentioned that there was a significant improvement, close to increase in size, close to 30% of tumor size between the first and second surgery. Now, for me, that was something of a surprise, because if you see the first surgery and you see the residual, now this is the residual just before the second surgery. But if I think Kavita's presentation had a slide where we had taken an MRI just after the first surgery, I think 3 months post surgery or whatever. So it was a fairly smallish lesion, or maybe your CT can show the same, because CT is just post-op. So if you see that there is a 30% increase in size in a fairly slow-growing tumor. Now, the reason for this, according to you, I'm not very sure. I mean, because we had embolized this tumor, we had resected a fair degree of tumor out. The carotid is stented, so there is very little chance of collaterals from the carotid itself, though that can't be ruled out. So it was a little bit of an unusual situation for me to see a, I would say, fast-growing tumor after the first resection. Though it's not entirely impossible, but it was a little surprising, because we took up the case within a year. And in fact, the reason for taking up a case within a year, because otherwise, if it was not growing so fast, I would have probably waited for 1 more year, because there's really no hurry. So what do you think is the reason? Is there something that we are missing here?
Okay, the thing is, we don't have a MRI immediately after the surgery. What I had is a CT. Okay. So the one thing possible is whatever we are estimating on a post-op CT, we may be underestimating, because soft tissue differentiation and contrast resolution is always best with MRI. Okay. So we always prefer to compare the same imaging modality at the same level for accurate estimation of how much it is growing.
Correct.
Okay. And second thing, this being a hypervascular tumor, there may be some recruitment of channels. That's why it has grown to this extent, which was unexpected.
Correct. Yes, and intraoperatively also it was a fairly bloody tumor. I mean, despite the brilliant embolization and all that, it was still a little expectedly, bloody, because it's a paraganglioma, and it was a little bit of a challenge to remove the large intradural component. Another issue is that I wanted to discuss with you is you touched upon the topic of leptomeningitis. Now, is there any chance that this could be a chemical meningitis? Because I have not had this in my series, but I've heard people saying that, let's say in a translabyrinthine approach where there is no chance of external, very unlikely, because the fat goes in and then we do a proper closure. It's not like, and if the postoral wound has healed well, I've had consultants telling me that there could be a situation where there is what is called a chemical meningitis due to the presence of fat. So do you think that can be differentiated in MRI, in radiology?
Yeah. Basically, when it comes to meningitis, the radiology is only to look for complications of meningitis. In fact, we don't advocate contrast MRI to diagnose meningitis. Meningitis has to be diagnosed by the CSF analysis. Even when sometimes there is CSF shows meningitis, we wouldn't be surprised if MRI shows it to be completely normal. Okay. So, and second thing, yeah, definitely it can be chemical meningitis because of fat, because of blood, or because of infection. And there would be no way we can differentiate from all three of them. Only thing what I can say is the irritation is only confined to the right-sided cortical pupil-parietal sulci, and there is no extension to the rest of the CSF spaces or basal cisterns. And there are few instances like where basal cisterns, there is fluid meningitis, we trying to say that this is tubercular, all those things. Otherwise, imaging is mainly to look for complications of meningitis like vasculitis, infarcts, epidural collection, subdural empyema, and not to, it will be very poor in telling the etiology of meningeal irritation.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I think that's all we have from the radiology. So I think I'll go ahead and do my presentation on some of the clinical aspects and the surgical part of paragangliomas. 1 minute, I will have to share my screen. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, please.
Yes. So this is my standard presentation on paragangliomas, skull-base paragangliomas. So between us as well, I think I want to strongly emphasize on the fact that the word paragangliomas must now replace glomus. I think we are quite loose with using the word glomus, and I also use it quite frequently because everybody else uses it around me as well. And but it has to be emphasized that the technical and clinical and pathological name of this tumor is paraganglioma, and I think we should always mention it by that name. So, can you hear me? Can all of you hear me? Is all fine? Everything is fine, no? So I begin my slides by always using this quotation from William Harvey, who I'm sure is very familiar to Dr. Mohan, because he discovered the circulatory system and the components of blood and did a lot of work as a pathologist, in the 1600s. And he very famously said, I profess to learn and to teach anatomy not from books but from dissections, not from the tenets of philosophers but from the very fabric of nature. So I always emphasize on the fact that it's very important for us to come out of books. Yes, we get theory knowledge, we get to know the information, the foundation is laid by the books, but it's very important to set sail into the sea, to test the waters, to sail in the ship rather than keeping the ship moored to the docks. So only when you get your hands wet and on temporal bones, on skull bases, on dissection specimens, that one learns the tenets of skull base surgery. So I always salute my boss, from whom I learned skull base surgery from, Professor Mario Sanna, with whom I was at the I was in the center for close to 6.5 years, and I've learned a lot from him, and I owe my skull base career to him. So paradigm shift is what we see these days in paraganglioma management. What has changed from, let's say, 20 years back? What has changed is we have comprehensively mapped the skull base. The skull base is no longer a dark area or a gray zone where it's difficult for neurosurgeons to get understand the anatomy of the temporal bone. It's difficult for the ENT surgeons to get into the near intracranial and the infratemporal parts of it. It is difficult for the head and neck surgeons to get into the bone and the intracranial area. So this confluence of three territories, the intradural territory or the temporal territory or the infratemporal or the upper neck anatomy, is what constitutes skull base. And a thorough mapping of the skull base is possible today. Rational and safe surgical approaches have thereby been described. Effective neuroradiological solutions, as seen by Chavadi's presentation, neuronavigation, neuromonitoring, all these have ensured that tumors like the one that you see on the right side are no longer considered inoperable. In the past, carotid infiltration, carotid involvement, whether it is in malignancies or in benign tumors, were considered inoperable, but today it is no longer so. And our case that we managed in this instance clearly shows that the carotid can be stented and the carotid can be dealt with, and hence nothing is today inoperable in the skull base. So I would not want to go to the anatomy, because this is something that you have seen. For those who follow me, I have been through this several times. I would not want to go through the anatomy, but this is a very interesting till I attempts me as well to go through the anatomy. Whenever I see anatomy, I just fall in love with it more and more. So many things to learn here, but I don't think we have the time, because this would take us the whole evening if I were to go through the anatomy. Now, I come to the topic, what are paragangliomas? Paragangliomas are slow-growing benign neuroendocrine tumors. They arise from the paraganglia in chromaffin negative glomus cells, and that's where the word glomus comes from, and they're derived from embryonic neural crests functioning as part of the sympathetic nervous system, and very importantly, they act as vascular chemoreceptors. So this is what is pathologically or microscopically what is a paraganglioma. They're closely related to pheochromocytomas, as we all know, which are chromaffin positive, and there could be pheochromocytomas in various parts of the body. So it's very important when there is a big tumor like the one we're dealing, and this is not that particular case. This is a slide from one of my earlier presentations. So this has pictures from all of my cases. So this is one such case where you see a tumor in the petrous apex going down into the temporal bone, widening the jugular foramen, going up to the clivus, and then going into the infratemporal fossa. The hypoglossal canal, the ocranial nerves are all involved by this tumor, and this could be a part of a multicentric tumor, and some of these tumors could be secretory, as mentioned by Dr. Mohan. Now, classification of skull-base paragangliomas, we go by the Fish classification. The most universally accepted classification is the Fish classification, which divides the temporal bone or skull-base paraganglioma into into temporal bone paragangliomas and neck paragangliomas. Temporal bone paragangliomas are further divided into tympanomastoid paraganglioma and tympanojugular paragangliomas. Tympanomastoid paragangliomas are commonly called glomus tympanicums, and tympanojugular paragangliomas are what are called glomus jugularis. Neck paragangliomas are of two types, and in fact, when I was seeing Dr. Chavadi's slide, one of the slides that he showed where there was a jugular foramen expansion, if some of you would recollect the slide where he showed a tumor going into the infratemporal fossa intracranial, a big paraganglioma, which is if you observe that, you will see that the mastoid part, the medial part, is fairly normal. So while he was mentioning that, I was beginning to wonder if that was a fairly advanced vagal paraganglioma. Now, a vagal paraganglioma can arise from around the vagus nerve, the vagus nerve, and then it goes along the skull base and goes into the hypoglossal canal and widens the jugular bulb, and then it can go intracranially. So in a fairly advanced low cranial paraganglioma, it could mimic a tympanojugular paraganglioma. Most tympanojugular paraganglioma have a mastoid and a midlier component, so that's how you can differentiate. Carotid body paragangliomas are the other most common paragangliomas which are found in the neck. Now again, I want to stress that we should no longer be calling it as glomus tumors, neither should we call them as glomus tympanicum, glomus jugulare, and surely not peritheliumus, fibroangiomas, sympathetic nevi, and also not chemodectomas. Now coming on to skull-based paragangliomas, temporal bone paragangliomas can be divided, as I told you, into tympanomastoid, tympanojugular. Now the tympanomastoid paragangliomas can be further divided into class A and class B. Tympanojugular paragangliomas are divided into class C1, C2, C3, C4, and D1. Now, it is by pure chance that class A and class B are followed by C and D. Now, tympanomastoid paragangliomas are a class by themselves, and they do not have any progressive status to tympanojugular paragangliomas. Remember that, all of you. A lot of people think that class A tumors become class B, which is true, and then class B becomes class C. No, there is a clear division or demarcation between tympanomastoid paragangliomas and tympanojugular paragangliomas. Tympanomastoid paragangliomas are midlia cleft tumors. Tympanojugular paragangliomas are skull-based tumors where the approach, everything changes because they're more deep-seated tumors centered around the jugular bulb and causing expansion of the jugular foramen area. Now, why C and D? Because the C classification is based on the relationship of the tumor to the carotid artery. So C1, C2, C3, C4, I will tell you in the next slides, are tumor references to various parts of the petrous carotid. And D stands for dura. So DE is dura extradural, DI is intradural. So if you see, by chance we have a class A to D, which probably could be misconstrued to a progressive class, but no, class A and B are a separate subset of tumors that belong to tympanomastoid paragangliomas, or glomus tympanicums, and class C and D are tympanojugular paragangliomas, and they are a separate section. So vagal paragangliomas, carotid body paragangliomas, and I'm not going to discuss, so I'm not going to talk about it. Now you need to know what the classification of a skull-based paraganglioma. It's very important for the surgeons and the radiologists to follow a standard, one single classification, and the most important classification today is a FISH classification. So what is a C1, class C1? As I showed you in the first slide, what is this class C1? C1 paraganglioma is that paraganglioma which arises around the jugular bulb, and since the jugular bulb is closely related to the carotid, there's always a carotid relation. So in relation to the carotid, it's not important, the jugular bulb is not important because we know that it is arising from the jugular bulb. But the carotid extension is what determines your surgical approach. So if the tumor is expanding the jugular bulb and just touching the carotid canal, the entry of the parapharyngeal carotid into the petrous carotid canal, petrous carotid foramen, that is a C1. It is just touching the or reaching the skull base and the petrous carotid foramen. So such tumors are called C1 tumors. Now, if you see here, there is this tumor. The jugular bulb looks fairly okay. The jugular bulb, but if you look closely, there is something, and there is a tumor in the midlia. And if you see that this tumor, if you look at the carotid canal, this is the entry of the carotid canal, maybe a little lower down. There is no tumor here. The jugular bulb also looks fairly normal, and there is no tumor except for a point at its entry. So that is C1. Okay, those are very small tumors. Now I have a problem with C1 tumors. C1 tumors are smaller tumors. Now again, if you look at the coronal section, you see that the tumor is limited to the entry of the carotid here, the petrous carotid. This is the petrous carotid. This is the petrous carotid here, going into the, this is the horizontal petrous carotid. This is the lateral carotid, and this is the lateral, and then the paraclavial carotid. So we're going the other way around now. So we're getting into the horizontal petrous on the right side, focus on the right side, and then you're getting into the vertical genu and the vertical petrous. Now at this point, you see that there is tumor in the jugular foramen. So this is a C1. I have a problem with C1s because these C1s can be, if an MRI is not done, these C1s can be mistaken to be tympanomastoid paragangliomas. Now, if there was just this tumor here, this much in the midlia, you could classify them as a glomus tympanicum or tympanomastoid paraganglioma. If sometimes, if you don't look carefully, and if you don't look for the jugular bulb erosion of the jugular bulb, and in this case you can see that the erosion is fairly minimal, so you could mistake this to be a tympanomastoid paraganglioma. And tympanomastoid paraganglioma does not involve a skull base surgery, it is more of an otological surgery. Okay, so tympanomastoid paragangliomas can be tympanojugular paragangliomas C1s can be misdiagnosed to be tympanomastoid paragangliomas because of the small size of the tumor. The small size of the tumor will mislead the clinician to because the jugular the foramen might not be expanded as significantly as it should be, and thereby it may go unnoticed. An MRI in such a case will clinch the diagnosis. Now, C2 tumors are tumors that go little further along the petrous carotid, the vertical petrous carotid, and goes up to the genu. Now, let's look at it in the axial section. You see, this is the skull base coming into view, the jugular process. And now you have the jugular foramen. There is tumor here very distinctly. There is a widening, again, moth-eaten appearance, irregularity. And if you look at the tumor here, it is coming up to the genu. But if you look past the genu, there is no tumor in the petrous portions of the carotid, in the genu or in the horizontal portions. This is tumor free. There is no real destruction of bone here, and the tumor is limited to the lower portions, especially the vertical petrous portion. Let us look at it in the coronal section. If you look at this, the petrous portion, again, I need to go back from here. The petrous portion is all free. The genu and the horizontal portion is free up to the lateral portion. So this is a C2. C3 is when the petrous bone is involved and the tumor has crossed the genu going up to the horizontal petrous carotid. Okay, so now you see, if you see this tumor, there is tumor in the petrous carotid, like in our present case, and this is the horizontal petrous carotid. So now the tumor is going posterior to the horizontal petrous carotid, also going down along the vertical petrous carotid down into the parapharyngeal space, into the infratemporal fossa. So this is a C3, which means the tumor has gone further up, further deeper into the petrous bone. Here you can clearly see that the petrous carotid is here, and there is tumor all around the petrous carotid. If you look at the petrous carotid, see there is tumor here, and there is tumor all around the petrous carotid. So the horizontal petrous carotid, sorry, and surely around the vertical petrous carotid as well. So this is C3. Anything larger than C3 is a C4. These tumors can go up to the cavernous sinus, can go up to the deep into the infratemporal fossa, midline, anywhere else, intradural. All this is C4. Now we have what is called the D class, that is the intradural part. Now, intracranial part, sorry. So the intracranial part again can be extradural or intradural. So this is another case where you can clearly see that there is tumor not only in the temporal bone, but there is a significant part which is intracranial, and this is intradural. So this is a DI. So this is clearly an intradural case going past the dura, and this is a what we call a class D tumor. So again, tympanojugular paragangliomas can be divided into class C and D. So it can be further divided into class C1, C2, C3, C4, and a bigger tumor could go intradural. So there can be a D class, and the D itself can be both extradural or intradural. Now, I'll again have to quit some of these slides for the want of time. Chavadi has dealt with some of these points. I would like to emphasize on this particular slide where we are now beginning to use what is called 18F-DOPA, dihydroxyphenylalanine, PET scans, along with PET-CT, which are highly sensitive and specific tools that can provide a confirmative diagnosis, because a lot of these tumors can, for those who are uninitiated in the skull base, some of these tumors can look, all of these tumors can look the same, you know. So for somebody as experienced as Chavadi, with all the information that he has, he could probably delineate some of these tumors and come to a correct diagnosis. But in many instances where the tumors are deep-seated and we don't have a tissue diagnosis, or in these cases, paragangliomas, which are highly vascular tumors, when you when you don't have the liberty to take a biopsy, you need to rely on radiology. So radiologically, if things are confusing, then you can do what is called a 18F DOPA scan, and these PET scans clinch the diagnosis. This was Srikant's PET scan. You can very clearly see, but it was not a 18F DOPA. I don't know what was done at Aster anyway. So I don't know the protocol used, but here you can clearly see that there is a tumor enhancement, and you can clearly see that there's a very large tumor in the skull base. Now I think this is a patient that was referred to me from the USA for a second opinion. Now this was a vagal paraganglioma, and this was a F18 DOPA scan, where you can see that F18 DOPA whole body scan, where you can clearly see this particular tumor. This turned out to be a vagal paraganglioma. Similarly, you can see that a whole body scan showed the cranium is here. So this was a tumor, a fairly large tumor in the skull base, turned out to be a vagal paraganglioma. Again, another scan here. So again, showing this tumor here in the skull base. This is PET CT of the same patient, showing the presence of tumor. If you can notice it around this area, that is too quick, I'm sorry. Anyway, so that was a vagal paraganglioma. Now, what is very important radiologically from a surgeon's point of view is a 4-vessel angiography. A 4-vessel angiography is a gold standard for investigating all skull base lesions and to know their blood supply. 4-vessel angiography is when you inject both the anterior and the posterior systems, and by doing so, you get a lot of information. In this case, you can see a clear tumor blush. So we do a 4-vessel angiography 1 day or 2 days prior to the surgery, because at the same time we can do an angiography along with what is called an embolization of the tumor. Embolization of a tumor is done to reduce the intraoperative bleeding and to solidify the tumor as much as possible, to make sure that there is not too much of a blood loss during surgery. Okay, but angiographies themselves are not the safest of procedures. They're very safe these days, and safety of angiographies has improved tremendously over the last couple of decades. And the recent retrospective study of 1,715 diagnostic cases at a high volume neurointerventional department showed practically zero neurological complications. So earlier we had this fear of some people would avoid embolization or 4-vessel angiography for the fear of let's say an ischemia, or a problem during either an angiography or during embolization, but no longer the case. I insist on this tool of investigation for all my patients, as I told you, 1 day or 2 days before the surgery and not more, because it also allows me to embolize the feeding vessels at the same sitting. So this is DSA pre-embolization. This is of Srikant. Yes, you can clearly see that there is a tumor blush here. Okay, very nice blush from the ascending pharyngeal artery. Srikant had, if I remember right, branches from the occipital artery, meningeal branches, and also intracranially there were branches from the petrous, the pica and the ICA, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So this is after embolization, and you can see that this is a very good embolization. There's practically no tumor blush, and this was what was given to me before the first surgery. So I had a great time operating on the patient because there was practically no bleeding and it was a pretty solid tumor. And if you can actually see, you can see the stent as well placed in the petrous carotid. You can clearly see the stent here in this DSA. Okay, So a balloon occlusion test. Now, there was a question, I think Dr. Ravi Shankar is here with us. I'll acknowledge his presence right now, but I'll talk to him a while later. And he, in the chat box here, has asked me a question about balloon occlusion. Why not a balloon occlusion, or what's the role of balloon occlusion? Now, for me, the carotid is precious, and as I told you, the carotid need not be sacrificed at all. Shrikant is a prime example. Now, this is a tumor that's 360 degree around the carotid. If the carotid can be preserved, it must be preserved, because you never know when and if the patient will have another paraganglioma. Now, in a young patient, 24, 23, 24-year-old male, when a young male like this develops a paraganglioma, you must be a little cautious about the future of this patient. You have to think ahead, and you need to plan for several decades ahead. Now, if I go ahead and resect, or if I do grafting of the carotid, which is bound to close over a period of time, you are essentially sacrificing one carotid. It's okay. You could get away with it, and you could probably resect the tumor, everything is okay. But what if this patient develops a carotid body tumor in the future on the opposite side? So in that case, and we are known, and paragangliomas are known to be familial, and some of these aggressive familial paragangliomas are often bilateral and multiple. So every effort should be made to preserve the ipsilateral carotid, and that is why I prefer to stent the carotid in all my cases. It's not that balloon occlusion can't be done, can be done, but I prefer to save it if it is possible. So this is a case where I did the balloon occlusion, this is not Shrikant's case. This is another case where this was occluded in a 5-year-old child with rhabdomyosarcoma. The carotid has been closed. If you see here, the petrous carotid is very clearly seen on the left side. On the right side, there is no carotid because the carotid was closed, for planning for a radical resection of the whole skull base in a 5-year-old child with rhabdomyosarcoma. You see that in children, it's always easy to occlude the carotid because of very nice collaterals from the opposite side. It's usually not a problem in the young age, but as decades pass, in elderly people, it is a problem. So in the past, if the delay between the arterial and venous phases during angiography was more than 2 seconds, that means that there is no good collateral supply. A partial removal, wait and scan, radiotherapy, or a carotid bypass were the options. Okay, so partial removal, wait and scan, which is to delay the eventual treatment, radiotherapy, or carotid bypass. But today we opt for stenting of the carotid if there is no satisfactory collateral opposite blood supply. Now, this is how we do a balloon occlusion test.
Yes, sir.
The patient is, this is of another patient. So this patient is undergoing a balloon occlusion test. So what is being done in the cath lab is that a femoral artery catheter is placed, and the catheter goes up to the ipsilateral carotid, and the balloon is dilated. And when the balloon is dilated, vitals are monitored for about 30 minutes. And this is followed by another 15 to 20 minutes of induced hypotension. And under induced hypotension, if there is no motor deficits, or if there is no problem, then we are sure that we are more or less sure. You can never be always 100% sure. More or less sure that this patient can undergo balloon occlusion either preoperatively or intraoperatively by means of clamping of the carotid. So here you see another patient undergoing a balloon occlusion test. You see that the patient is not sedated.
Yes, sir. 30 minutes recording.
30 minutes recording.
Sir, what is your name? Can you show me your tongue? Okay, say E, show me your teeth. Okay.
If you can see here, what's happening is we are constantly talking to the patient, asking the patient to raise their hands and legs, and constantly engaging the motor activity of this patient while occluding the carotid using a balloon. So we'll proceed.
Lift your left hand up. Make a fist. Open. Make a fist. Bring it down slowly. Then you move your feet.
Okay. At the same time, an EEG recording is done for the whole duration of the
Sir, what
procedure.
is your name? Can you show me your tongue? Okay, say E, show me a T. Okay. Lift your left hand up. Make a fist. Open.
Okay. So stenting, when do you consider stenting of the internal carotid artery? When there is more than 3/4 circumferential engulfment of the carotid, which means that when there is a greater than 270-degree engulfment of the carotid, when there is stenosis of the carotid, when you see irregularities in the angiogram, when there is extensive blood supply coming from the carotid itself, that is when stenting becomes necessary, because then you cut off those the blood supply from the carotid directly, coming directly from the carotid. In post-irradiation cases, because when you're operating on a post-irradiated patient, when you're on the carotid, you don't want to risk a carotid blowout. So you would want to reinforce these fragile carotids, post-RT carotids, by putting a stent within the carotid. And when there is a single ipsilateral internal carotid artery, which means that let's say you've got a patient which has a tumor on the ipsilateral side, had a tumor on the contralateral side, somebody has resected the carotid out along, let's say, a carotid body tumor. Carotid has been resected. In the process of removing the carotid body tumor, now you have the patient coming to you with the single carotid, and there is a tumor around the carotid, either a vagal paraganglioma, a carotid body tumor, or a tympanojugular paraganglioma. In all these cases, a stenting of the carotid becomes mandatory. Now, in this is again Shrikant's case. You can clearly see the stent within the petrous carotid, very nicely applied. And I'm sorry, it's going very fast, but you can very clearly see the stent once the dye is injected, and that's what we did before this case. And in this case, in the post-op CT, also you can clearly see the stented carotid. Now this is the vertical petrous carotid. Now we're getting into the horizontal petrous carotid. You see this horizontal petrous carotid, you see the stent very nicely seen, going all the way up to the paraclival. This is the lateral carotid, paraclival carotid. And in the paraclival carotid, it stops, and that is the end of the stent. And that's how the whole carotid has been stented. Makes the procedure so much easy, makes life easy for everybody. Now let's go to the case per se. Now I will skip this whole slide and go to Shrikant's case. Now this is his case. So this is his pre-op recording. You see,
oh, sorry, close your eye.
1 year pre-op facial nerve paralysis and low cranial paralysis.
Yes. Lift your eyebrows. Say E. Blow.
See, his voice is hoarse. He is not able to purse his lips.
Okay. Say ah. Loudly. Loudly. Put your tongue out.
You see a clear wasting of the tongue on the right side.
Oh, sorry. Close it. Blow. Okay. Say ah. Loudly. Loudly. Put your tongue out. Left. Right. Okay. Lift your shoulders. Both the shoulders.
Okay. So these are the surgical steps of the first. We do all the surgeries under neuromonitoring. Even if there is facial nerve paralysis, I use a neuromonitor to get some vital information intraoperatively. Post-oral wide C-shaped incision going down into the neck. Flaps are elevated in the subperiosteal plane in 2 layers, skin and subcutaneous tissue in the first layer, and the mucoperiosteal layer as the second layer. Then a wide mastectomy is done. Middle fossa dura is here in this case, we keep a thin layer of bone on the middle fossa dura. So the middle fossa dural plate, as we say, is preserved. Sigmoid sinus is completely made bare. And here in this case, if you see, I've opened the neck. I've got control over all the major vessels of the neck. The carotid and the IJV are controlled by using vascular loops, and removing the tumor from the temporal part. Now this is the jugular bulb area. The cochlea is here. This is the jugular bulb area. You see, I've actually been successful in separating the facial nerve from the tumor, but it's useless exercise eventually, because the nerve is quite irregular and there's practically no activity in this nerve. This is a nerve that is only anatomically intact, but physiologically there is nothing much that is going to come out of this nerve. So I decided to cut the nerve. So that's the proximal end, distal end. I cut both the parts of the nerve, and I went ahead and did a nerve graft. Okay, before that I went ahead and removed the tumor. Now I, with the nerve out of my way, I have full access to the jugular foramen. This is the whole area of the tumor, and now you see the whole jugular foramen. This is the occipital condyle area. Carotid is here. This is the petrous carotid. You can see this is the entrance of the carotid in the this is the petrous canal. So this is where the lower border of the bone would have stopped. This is the skull base, so to say. This is the petrous carotid, and there is tumor all behind. Everything has been removed, and this is now the tumor on the dura. Now, if I follow this tumor, I will encounter CSF. I'll get intracranial, I'll get CSF. Now, where is the CSF going to go? It is going to go into this whole cavity right down into the neck. So this patient has to be on lumbar drain for weeks, or he will, and during in the interim, he will develop meningitis and other complications. So this is the reason why I leave behind some tumor. If I've achieved this kind of temporal, infratemporal pericarotid resection, I consider this to be a good surgery. In this case, we have closed the sigmoid sinus here, closed the IJV, and resected the whole. There's no IJV here. You see the blue loop has gone. Okay, so this is the blue loop. The IJV was here, and I've removed all this. All this is tumor from this point all the way up to the undersurface of the cochlea. We have removed everything. The cochlea, in fact, has been drilled out, and only the labyrinthine, the lateral semicircular canal and the labyrinthine block is kept as a landmark for the next surgery. Otherwise, when you put fat here, in the next surgery, you will be thoroughly confused as to where you are without any anatomical landmarks, because there's practically no skull base. So the one landmark that we leave behind is either the cochlea or the labyrinthine block, or probably even both. In this case, the cochlea has been drilled out. So now you see that the tumor is completely removed, carotid, petrous carotid, and it's looking dirty here, the petrous carotid, because there is tumor infiltrating the carotid, and I have left behind some tumor and coagulated the surface of the carotid, under which there is the stent. Now I have to do one thing. I have to graft. What I attempted to do, you can see the low cranial nerve, the 11th cranial nerve is intact. We have kind of preserved it. Now I took a sural nerve graft from the leg, and I grafted the two cut ends of the facial nerve towards the end of the surgery. So with this, I hoped that the patient would regain some amount of facial nerve function for whatever it is worth. To my surprise, so this was tumor resection. Now there was some tumor in the petrous bone in this area, and this was the this is the intradural part. You see the intradural part and this petrous component. All that is the one which is left behind. Now, after 18 months, you'll see that this is what I was discussing with Chavdi a while earlier. You see that there is a fair bit of enlargement in the size of tumor between the 6th month and the 18th month, at least a 20-30% enlargement. So that was a little surprising. Anyway, this is the post-op CT after the first surgery. Again, you will see the stent here. You can see the stent going all the way, and some tumor behind the stented portion of the carotid. To my surprise, the graft, which was more than 5 centimeters, took up completely, and he's able to close his eyes. This is without a lid implant. Mind you, a lot of people show post-op facial nerve pictures with a lid implant, saying that the patient's facial nerve is improved. This is not without without any lid implant. Patient is able to close his eyes, so I would consider this a recovery to HB grade 3. Okay, so at least in the upper branches, it is HB grade 3. Now, after the surgery, you see the vocal cord looks absolutely normal. Honestly, this is a paralyzed right-sided larynx. The right larynx is completely paralyzed, but there is compensation from the left larynx, because of which his voice came back to normal, which is what Kavita has shown in her previous slides. And swallowing was also normal. There was no aspiration, no pooling of saliva. So this patient had regained or compensated for the 9th and the 10th cranial nerve paralysis because of the contralateral hyperactivity of the contralateral cranial nerves. Now we coming on to the second surgery. If you look at the second surgery, This is what we see when we go inside the second time into the same cavity. Now what we have to do is go in a different tangent. Now we have removed the infratemporal component, temporal component. Again, this is the lateral semicircular canal. I'm looking at this under the microscope. The previous pictures were external pictures. Middle fossa dura, sigmoid sinus, labyrinthine block preserved as a landmark. There is no tumor in this area, but this is all tumor, and this is all intradural, and it's a fairly enlarged intradural component. So I had to go intradural this time. I separated removed the fat, cleared off the fat, drilled out the labyrinthine block. Now, while drilling out the labyrinthine block, I had to be careful about the grafted facial nerve. And I went inside. I'm removing tumor slowly. Now I'm coming to the intradural part of the tumor. Now this is the internal auditory meatus component of the facial nerve and the eighth the eighth nerve complex, and there's tumor all around, infiltrating the nerve and the posterior fossa. So this is the nerve. This is all infratemporal. It's just one cavity because there's no skull base, no. So it's one big cavity. Carotid is here, and we go inside. Remove tumor again. Middle fossa is here. Posterior fossa is here. All this is tumor. All this is tumor. So all this has to be removed. Now we go on removing tumor till we identify the brain structures, and then we go on removing tumor like this. So this is how it is removed, progressively debulked and progressively reduced in size. Now this is again internal auditory meatus. I had to preserve the internal auditory meatus and the root entry zone of the facial nerve because we know that we had a grade 3. So whatever is left of the facial nerve had to be preserved, and tumor had to be peeled away from the proximal segments of the facial nerve. We can see very clearly the ICA loop, labyrinthine artery. This is the facial nerve root entry zone going into the pons area here. So you see it's going here. This is the root entry zone. This is the internal auditory meatus, and the tumor has been completely removed. Last bits of tumor are being removed. And now you can see that there is no tumor, and we have achieved total excision of the intradural portion. Now this is actually the root entry zone of the facial. Can you see this? Can you see this grayish line here? I'm testing the root entry zone of the facial with a nerve monitor, and we have been able to elicit a response, which means that we have preserved the facial nerve. So you see complete tumor resection intradurally. There's no tumor left behind, and we close the cavity with fat. Now this is post-op. He had a little bit of a facial weakness, temporary. Now after a couple of months, he went back to his pre-op facial. What I mean is pre-op. When I say pre-op, before the second surgery. So he's gone back to his HB grade 3. You see that his facial nerve is recovered, and what we see is a small residual in the petrous apex, which I hope to take care of using radiotherapy, or probably I'll do a middle fossa approach as a third stage for this tumor. You see this part is what is left behind here, and that part I can either do a middle fossa approach, or I can refer the patient to radiotherapy in the near future. So that is as far as this. So again, these are the post-op images. Complete tumor clearance everywhere. All this is fat except for a small portion here, I guess, here in this part in the petrous apex, which I hope to remove or control using radiotherapy in the near future. So no, this is another case. I'm sorry. No, this is another case. No, sorry, this is pre-op of another patient. So okay, so we stop here. I'm sorry. So this is the last slide. So this is post-op CT after the second surgery, and the patient is on follow-up and he is doing well. Now I don't think Kavita, we have the time to show the surgical videos. We'll use it. I have a talk coming up on 25th regarding the anatomy of the jugular foramen and that area. So probably I'll get some time then, because it's a solo talk, and probably I'll have some time to show the actual surgical clips of this particular surgery. I don't think we have time today. It's already 8 o'clock, and I think we need to close this session. So thank you once again It's been a wonderful session, wonderful debate, wonderful exchange of ideas. And Ravi Shankar, again, thanks. I hope I've answered your question. Ravi is here. Can I unmute him? Is there any way, Kavita, can you unmute him? Yeah. Ravi, you want to say something? He's a senior skull-based surgeon from SCP.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very good evening, sir.
Thank you,
Very
Ravi,
nice
for
present.
joining us.
Yes. So very nice presentation. Actually, we are frequently encountering such a cases. The problem with our team was the affordability.
Yes.
So our patients can't afford the stenting. We have tried 1 or 2 patients, but
Yes.
they are not affordable. And then what we did was almost a near total removal, and we left the disease over the carotid and then send them for RT.
Yes,
So
yes.
this is what we are doing here.
Correct.
Otherwise, that's the only doubt. Whether most of our patients are young patients, and that's a concern of carotid ligation.
Correct.
So whether we'll go for a carotid ligation. Another concern was if you do the stenting at such a young age. So what is the long-term problems? So they are lifelong anticoagulants, and what is the possibility of embolizations and stroke, a possibility?
Yes, yes. So, I can talk about my experience with Grupo, because if you're looking at a long-term follow-up, I'll have to talk about Mario's series, and he was the one who started stenting of the petrous carotids, and he's got a large series now. Almost all the cases that have been stented, as far as I know, have done well. There has been no closure of stents. There has been no thrombosis leading to stent closure, as far as I know. And Srikant's stent is working. I mean, it's been a year and a half now. So for a good year and a half, I don't think there is any evidence of any lumen narrowing or any this thing. At this point, I'd probably like to bring in Dr. Mohan also. So what do you think about the possibilities of stent closure? But because yes, I know many. I mean, I've been to several conferences, and this is a question brought about by many people who have had experiences with wherein they have encountered thrombosis after application of stent, not in the previous carotids but elsewhere, and they raise it as a flag it as a concern. So what do you say, Dr. Mohan?
Yeah, what I feel is basically, these patients needs to be on antiplatelets, basically single antiplatelet agent. After generally what happens after the bare metal stent, whether it is a carotid or whether it's a coronary when we place, the endothelization will happen. Since most of the time what we place is a bare metal stent, and also the internal carotid artery size is quite big. So instant restenosis rate is not that high actually. It's less only. So only the concern and the only thing what we should do to reduce the risk of stent thrombosis. Stent thrombosis is a concern in the initial period. It's not like for a long-term period problem. It's like initial, let's say 1 month or 1 year for that matter. If it is a drug-eluting stent we place, the risk of stent thrombosis is very high in first 1 year. If you place a bare metal stent, the risk of stent thrombosis is very high in first 1 month. So that's why we must continue this dual antiplatelet for all these patients. After 1 month, so what will happen? The endothelization will happen. Mostly more than 90 to 95% of the stent would have endothelized, and it has become the part of the vessel. So after that, the patient will be kept on at least single antiplatelet agent and statin. So I don't think it's a very big concern from our side. Second thing is, even if you lose one internal carotid artery, obviously it's like the circular fill is supplied from the other internal carotid arteries. So it's relatively a safe thing to do.
Yeah, okay. Again, in our population, because I'm working in a government setup, money is a concern.
Yeah, I know.
Correct. Right. I mean,
it's a huge expenditure. I think he has incurred. I think our patient.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely. So, but yes, so for those who can afford, I think this should be the protocol. Everywhere else, I think we have to tailor the treatment policies according to the needs and according to the financial implications for that patient. So thanks, Ravi. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so I think it's time to close the presentation. Thank you, Dr. Mohan, Chavdi, and
Thank you, sir.
Kavita, and everybody else who has joined us for today's session. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Sampath. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.